BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Biotech. As a world-leading healthcare intelligence and clinical research organization dedicated to the needs of small and mid-sized biopharma companies, Biotech helps biotech organizations meet their critical milestones and deliver data and evidence-based results to investors, large pharma partners, and regulatory authorities. Biotech advances clinical research by offering integrated outsourced services and solutions delivered by dedicated biotech teams and management that understand the different pressures faced by biotechs in their drive to solve today's challenges without losing sight of their mission to deliver life-changing innovations tomorrow.
The Trump administration's overhaul of FDA is still underway, but the agency has already veered away from its decades-long trajectory in ways that will profoundly reshape medical product development and the lives of U.S. patients and beyond. On the latest BioCentury This Week podcast, we'll look at who the winners and losers are likely to be as FDA changes shape. Plus, lessons in lean innovation, how Belgian biotech Esobiotech went from a 14 million euro seed round to a fast exit with its in vivo CAR T while leveraging China development. And Monday has brought a deal for another in vivo CAR T with Abbvie as the buyer. We'll also discuss how molecular glues could be the future of selective CDK2 targeting, and Compass. It has a psilocybin therapy that met its endpoint, and yet investors were skeptical. We'll discuss all this on the BioCentury This Week podcast. I'm Jeff Cranmer, executive editor here at BioCentury, and joining me are my colleagues
Simone Fishburne, editor-in-chief.
Steve Austin, Washington editor.
Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
Paul Bonanos, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
Okay, well, we're gearing up for our second Grand Rounds conference of the year. We are going to head to Simone's homeland, U.K. And the first iteration this year was in Chicago. It was quite a success. Simone, what are you looking forward to at the Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge?
Well, I've just come off a call on that, and I got to be honest, one of the things that I'm looking forward to is seeing Americans in Cambridge walking around wondering what the Porter's Lodge is and the Buttery and a whole host of words that will mean nothing to them. This is going to be a source of some entertainment for me. Beyond that, actually, we do have content as well. There's going to be an incredibly compelling pizzazz session with Kate Bingham moderating a fireside chat with Patrick Vallance, who's the Minister of State for Science, Research and Innovation, basically the Minister of Science. And just a reminder to people, Kate Bingham, who is leading VC at SV Health, was also the head of the UK's vaccine program during the pandemic. I will also be moderating a fireside chat with the chair of AstraZeneca UK, Sean Grady. So I'm excited about that. And we have two outstanding keynote talks, one from Steve Jackson, who is professor of biology at Cambridge University and group leader and is with Cancer Research UK, and Sarah Teichmann, who is professor and chair at Cambridge Stem Cell Institute. And on top of that, we have a host of panels that we will be marketing this week and announcing the panels and the panelists for many of them. So a lot to come and a lot already there on that really, really exciting agenda.
And there will be many VCs in the house. I know for one, Syncona will be a sponsor on this year's program. And presenting companies and posters. If you're interested, please reach out to me. We already have about 12 companies signed up to present. I'm also recruiting presenting companies for our China Healthcare Summit, and that's in October. So Grand Rounds will be September 17th through 19th in Cambridge, UK, and then we'll head to Shanghai a month later. Don't miss out on China. We're going to talk a bit about that later in the pod, but first, things are changing at FDA. And Steve Usden, our Washington editor, who's been covering the agency for 3 decades, which is tough if you're a young 33-year-old. Steve's here to tell us about it.
Yeah, I
Seriously,
don't know how to follow up on
I
that.
had coffee with this dude earlier. He really is a young 33-year-old. I'm telling you that. He started age 3. He's very precocious.
Yeah. Here's the background. FDA's experienced staffing cuts, maybe as much as 20% of the agencies left since January. We don't really know because despite their vows of radical transparency, they haven't really provided information about who's left and also among the staff who were laid off, which ones were rehired. But there are a lot of staff who have left. There's concern about the politicization of regulatory decisions. Commissioner McCary has explicitly said that he's expanding FDA's mission to include advancing policies that aren't directly tied to patient benefit. All of these things have disrupted longstanding norms. Clearly, look, the loss of institutional memory resulting from the exodus of experienced FDA leaders, the longtime leader of CBER, the longtime leader of CDER, the head of the Office of New Drugs at CDER, the Office of Therapeutic Products at CBER, on and on and on. Those changes, that loss of institutional memory is irreversible. Those people aren't coming back. That knowledge has gone out the door with them and it's not coming back. Some of the other disruptions, like operational glitches that are caused by administrative staff layoffs, could be transient. They could fix those problems. Another thing I think that's long-term, I don't know if it's permanent, but it's certainly persistent, is FDA's alignment with HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s MAHA agenda. And that includes his anti-vaccine agenda on the one hand, and on the other hand, for example, it includes his enthusiasm for psychedelic drugs. We'll be talking about the psilocybin trial later on in the show. The question is then, what does all that mean for FDA, right? And what does that mean for the companies that rely on it, for the patients that rely on those companies? I think that it means that there's volatility and unpredictability. It's going to be more difficult for FDA to provide the kind of consistent guidance that it has in the recent years been providing to, especially to smaller companies. So what does that mean? It means, I think it creates a comparative advantage for big pharma companies because they have in-house that regulatory expertise. In many cases, they have ex-FDA staff who are helping them guide their regulatory activities. They have the ability to conduct large clinical trials. And I think it's also going to benefit companies that are developing products that are on well-trod paths, where there's clear, unambiguous endpoints and they can conduct large phase 3 trials that'll be convincing the FDA. Who are going to be the losers? I think small biotechs that depend on that kind of guidance, you could say hand-holding that they've gotten from FDA in the past, it's going to be more challenging for them. I think companies that are developing products that may not be consistent with the MAHA agenda are probably going to run into difficulties. Obviously, that means vaccines. Also probably means products that are based on mRNA technologies and drugs that are intended to treat neuropsychiatric conditions, especially for children. All those things are going to be problematic.
I have a question for you. You've talked about how the farmers have got that kind of expertise in-house, and for small biotechs, it's quite hard. Well, the playbook for small biotechs has for a long time been to get regulatory consultants. And I would think that with the number of people who've left FDA, there might be quite a lot of people out there who will become consultants with regulatory experience. My question, though, is how much that experience will be useful now? Is it a completely different FDA? Or do you think that is the best path for such companies?
Well, it's not a completely different FDA. It's a completely more unpredictable FDA. I think some of the things that we're going to see coming up in the next few months are going to help companies know kind of how much has changed and how much has remained the same. For example, I mentioned that there's a vacancy leading CBER's Office of Therapeutic Products. That's because Nicole Verdun, who was in that position for some time and is very highly respected by industry and patient groups alike, was abruptly fired last week, right? So then there's the question, companies that have been developing products and developing strategies based on advice that they've received from Nicole Verdun over the last year or two, they have to be thinking now, is that advice still valid? will they still be able to rely on the things that they were told by people who are no longer at FDA? We're going to find out the answers to some of those questions in the next few months. One of the things, it's a story that's just come out in BioCentury, is looking at approval decisions, PDUFA decisions that are coming up between now and the end of the year for some rare disease gene and cell therapies and an enzyme replacement therapy that are based on a biomarker, heparan sulfate, for neuronal MPS disorders. That's a policy that Peter Marks, the recently departed director of CBER, and Nicole Verdun were very actively involved in developing and giving the companies the assurance that FDA would accept this biomarker endpoint, and that unleashed quite a bit of development. If it turns out that the companies can't rely on that advice, it means two things. One, it's going to be an enormous setback for those companies, and especially for the patients who are depending on those products. If those products for two different kinds of MPS disorders are not approvable based on that biomarker, it essentially means the end of product development for MPS. But it also would send a signal to other companies that they're not going to be able to rely on the advice that they've been given over the last year or two, especially by Nicole Verdun and CBER. So a lot of people are going to be looking very closely at those decisions to see what they mean going forward. I think a lot of people also are going to be looking at how Commissioner McCary fills some of these key leadership appointments that are empty right now to see what direction the agency is going to go in and how much it's likely to change going forward. The key one, of course, is Director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, also who's going to replace Nicole Verdun. A job that doesn't get as much attention as it probably should is Chief Counsel. Commissioner McCary arranged for the appointment of Hillary Perkins to be Chief Counsel. That lasted for 2 days until Senator Josh Hawley objected to her, and she resigned. That position is empty now. The Chief Counsel position is really important because the Chief Counsel really sets the parameters for what FDA can do. The Chief Counsel can basically restrain FDA from issuing certain kinds of guidances or from interpreting the law in certain ways, or can enable the FDA to do those things. So that job is critically important. The fact that it's become even more political now than it has been in the past is something that's going to be a factor in both in who they appoint to that position and the kind of decisions that they make. And by the way, the Chief Counsel is likely to be involved very quickly in some politically sensitive decisions, for example, about FDA's regulatory policies with regard to mifepristone, the abortion drug.
Steve, you had reported a few days ago now, maybe a week ago now, that Karim Mikhail was in the running to get that CDER job. Does that still have legs? Are you hearing other names?
I'm not hearing other specific names. What I'd heard, so Karim Mikhail was hired by Commissioner McCary to serve as a senior advisor in the office of the commissioner. He's a former CEO of Amarin and was a longtime executive at Merck. I'd heard that he was being vetted and considered to be CDER director. I haven't heard any other specific names. It's actually a little bit surprising that we haven't seen an announcement yet of who's going to get that job. We have seen an announcement of Michael Davis has been named deputy CDER director. And honestly, his appointment was a surprise. It was a surprise to people at FDA. And it was a surprise to senior FDA officials when they found out about it. He doesn't have the kind of background and experience that a lot of people would have expected for a deputy CDER director. He was an FDA staffer from 2016 to 2022. He was a lead physician when he left. That's kind of a middle-level position in the Division of Psychiatry. After he left, he became the chief medical officer at the USONA Institute. And I think that experience may be what resonated with Commissioner McCary and perhaps with Secretary Kennedy. The USONA Institute is involved in conducting clinical trials of psychedelics to treat depressive order and other psychiatric conditions. And as I said before, it's a really high priority for Secretary Kennedy to get psychedelics approved for those conditions. He told FDA last week that he expects FDA to make an approval decision on a psychedelic within a year. So people are thinking that Davis probably was given that position in large part because of his experience in overseeing clinical trials of psychedelic drugs.
Selena, do you want to jump in here? You've been following the psychedelic space quite closely for us.
Sure. I mean, we can just get into the Compass results.
Yeah, why don't we dig in?
Right. So after the Lykos debacle, where that company's NMDA therapy was shot down by the agency for post-traumatic stress disorder, the next most advanced candidate came from a company called Compass Pathways. And so Compass has, made various arguments to say why it's not going to have the same fate as Lykos, steps it has taken to avoid that. And a lot of people have been watching this one really closely. And it's just an interesting situation because this is a depression trial. The primary endpoint was, Motter's Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale. So standard endpoint. And they met their goal. Like it was powered, I think, for about a 3-point change. They got 3.6. This is not uncommon in this field to have drugs approved on that kind of efficacy data. But investors, slash 40% from the company's value that day. So why is that, right? This class of therapies really struggles from something in a more profound way than other psychiatric drugs. Not exclusively, just it's a bigger problem, which is functional unblinding, right? And so if you have trials that are structured in such a way that, well, if you have a situation where your drug is so obvious to whoever takes it, its subjective effects, its psychedelic effects are so obvious that everybody knows immediately what group they're in, even though it was technically blinded. You introduce a lot of, expectation, bias, other things. So companies have been saying, okay, the way you get around that really is you show a really big effect size and then you show it's durable. And then it becomes harder to argue that even if there's some bias in there, that there isn't some real effect. And in phase 2, this Compass program produced a 6.6 change on this same endpoint, which is considered quite robust. That efficacy came down to 3.3 in their first phase 3 against placebo, where you would think the maximum benefit, the maximum magnification that could be in the effect size would be present. They have a second phase 3 going on where they're testing it against a couple of lower doses of the same drug. So in that case, you have some of the subjective feelings, but it's not, or at least what they saw in phase 2, it's not effective. So we'll see what that study shows. But, in general, the expectation would be you might have a smaller difference from placebo there. And this is pretty much the lower bound for clinical meaningfulness.
What do we know in terms of persistence of benefit?
So these were 6-week data. The company has 12-week and then another longer time point coming still, but we won't see that until next year.
So what do you think, if we're looking at an agency now where they're under pressure from the HHS secretary to approve psychedelics for PTSD, for depressive disorder, do you think that this kind of, if there's a finger on the scale here, does that make it more likely that this drug or other drugs are going to be able to overcome some of this skepticism that people have about unblinding?
Yeah, I mean, it met its endpoint, and its efficacy is in the range of Spravato and Avulidy and other depression drugs, right? So you could certainly make a case for approval if you decided that the magnitude of the problem that comes from functional unblinding is not something, is a showstopper for you.
Right. And there's two different angles of this, Selena. There's the whether the regulators will approve it, which you've both just talked about. There's also how payers will look at it. I don't know what payers would want to pay if they feel, for example, the finger's on the scale, but it's not actually working as well as it might. I did have another question about the clinical trial design. Are there any specific, tricks or of the trade or something like that, run-in periods or something that can be used to mitigate that? I don't know if you call it a placebo effect or functional unblinding. Yeah. And did they use those? Could they have done any more than they did is really my question.
It's just a fundamental issue with the class. No, you can't do a run-in. I mean, if you've done a psychedelic once at a lower dose and then later you do it at a higher dose, as long as you got at least a few days in between there, it's still going to be powerfully psychedelic, right? So other psychiatric drugs also have some functional unblinding, but those subjective effects tend to be a little more subtle. These are very profound. In addition to that, there's just been a lot of media coverage about how psychedelics are going to like revolutionize mental health. And so there's, coupled with the functional unblinding, a huge amount of expectation bias. So I think that was some of the challenges that Lykos ran into. In terms
of, if this gets improved, does it become the standard that the next ones get measured against?
If they're in the same, setting, if it gets approved on data like this, it won't change the benchmark for companies, right? It is within the range of efficacy that has been approvable before.
So the other thing that's interesting about these drugs is that, unlike most of the other kind of drugs that we report about, they're used explicitly in combination with therapy, right?
And not necessarily. So the Lykos one was. And that made it one of the complicating factors in the advisory committee meeting, because the advisors were like, you haven't designed your program in such a way that we can tease out the independent effects of the therapy and the drug. And we can't know that here. So what companies are doing, right, are they saying, we're not doing therapy. This is not therapy assisted drug treatment or drug treatment assisted therapy or whatever. We're doing preliminary calls to set expectations, talk about what the experience might be like, to give them support, but this is not therapy. But all of that, of course, if you don't do it very carefully, can just increase that expectation bias that something very profound is going to happen to you. So it's a delicate situation.
Okay, well, you can read Steve's story on BioCenturyPodcast.com. And Selena's look at the Compass data as well. Obviously, interesting space, evolving space. Selena will keep on top of all the latest readouts and the regulatory outlook for these psychedelic therapies. We're going to take a quick break, and then we will be back to discuss how Jean-Pierre Leterre led his company, his Belgian Biotech, from a $14 million seed into early clinical proof of concept for an advanced modality in just 4 years.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe. Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, this September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
We're back, and we were talking about a few of our conferences at the top of the pod. We had a great discussion in Bruges a few weeks back. We had Jean-Pierre Leterre join us at BioEquity Europe in conversation with Simone, and he talked about how he brought his company quite quickly from raising the first couple of euro to getting his proof of concept for the company's in vivo CAR T, and then a fairly tidy deal with AstraZeneca. Selena, you wrote a story on this. Simone, you had the conversation. Who wants to jump in first here?
I can set the context a little, and then Simone can tell the story and give her takeaways. It just so happened, like in the weeks leading up to our BioEquity Europe conference, where Simone had this conversation with Jean-Pierre. I had a few conversations where, using the same language, people said that one of the things that European biotechs often lack compared to like their US counterparts is a sense of urgency. And so that was like in my mind. And then at the same time, of course, there's all these background discussions going on about the rise of China and how that ecosystem is just redefining what speed and capital efficiency look like. And so when I was listening to this fireside chat, I was just sort of struck by Esobiotech being a really good example of having laser focus on product development from day one out of European biotech, and then cleverly using a global development, a China development strategy to leapfrog more highly resourced competitors to that exit. But Simone, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks. Selena did a really great job of setting up that conversation as a case study. I would also say that I'm sure Jean-Pierre Leterre will credit all of his team and so on. But really, when you listen to it, a lot of it is a story about leadership, about one person making decisions, not being afraid to make decisions, bringing people along, going, finding money where he needed to, and then going and carving a path, as you said, Selena, sort of using resources that he could find cheaper and faster and better in China than he was going to be able to find locally. So a lot of it was very strategic and his thinking. I mean, he worked with consultants and contractors, and that again was a decision, identified the particular technology that he was looking at. And so his personal story had taken him via CAR T technologies, first autologous and then allogeneic, and being incredibly enthusiastic about each of those and then finding their limitations. And so where he ended up with also, I don't know if Lauren wants to comment on this, but is one of the other rising themes, certainly in drug development, which is in vivo CAR Ts. So he sort of straddled the world and addressed the problems that autologous and allogeneic bring up with a genetic approach to creating CAR Ts. Even before that was really such a buzzword as it is now. The timeline, of course, gave him good data very early on that AstraZeneca paid him handsomely for. And I think we know also that by the time he was having conversations with them, there were several other farmers that were getting involved. So there's also a not just strategic, but drug development and scientific angle on this. One more point, though, and Selena, you pointed this out quite clearly in your analysis of this, which is that he was very insistent on not doing science for science's sake. And so what he did, in fact, was he was, in fact, working with the contractors as they were developing the construct and developing the clinical plan. They were working hand in glove, really. So the research was done with them, but it was very, very focused. It was not blue sky, what might happen. It was incredibly translational or applied, you might say. That's not a judgment on people who do go and do more blue sky research. But in this case, it certainly allowed him to go very fast on really quite a small amount of money and turn that around quite fast. I don't know if, Lauren, do you have any comments about where in vivo CAR T is these days as a technology?
Well, I think this company has helped put in vivo CAR Ts on the map. It's one of the first two to show any human efficacy data. And this was what people are sort of leaning on as proof of concept for this entire new modality, that if it does prove as effective as some of this very early, single patient data suggests that it could be, this is using a viral vector the same way that you would for a gene therapy that selectively targets T cells, expresses the CAR inside the body, and eliminates all of that complexity that goes along with a cell therapy, especially an autologous cell therapy, where you have to take the cells out and lymphodeplete the patients and put the cells back in. And if this does turn out as everyone's hoping, it's a game changer in this field of cancer therapy.
And in terms of using China to accelerate your early development, I mean, a lot of folks are interested in that. A lot of folks are skeptical of that. I don't think it'd be easy to, replicate what Esobiotech was able to do here because the devil is always in the details, right? They had a really unique benchmarking opportunity. So they had their lentiviral vector that they had licensed, but the CAR for their first product came from China, and it had already been the very same CAR construct had been used in an autologous therapy that had been tested in people, at least 30 patients worth of data. And so they had the ability to benchmark against that existing data with the same construct and really prove that their platform can do in vivo what autologous therapies do after all that complicated ex vivo manufacturing. You're not going to find that everywhere, but still the point is they were looking broadly and they were willing to think about alternative and unusual routes, and they did their homework very quickly and they found themselves a path. And probably going forward, not everybody's going to be able to do that, but they should be considering it. They shouldn't be ignoring the route as they formulate their strategy.
It's a great read, and I ask you, what can China do for your development program? You can come to Shanghai for the 12th BioCentury and Bay Helix China Healthcare Summit McKinsey will be joining us again. You'll be able to meet with Chinese companies who have been coming year in, year out to our conference, get into some partnering discussions, perhaps over a delicious San Pellegrino. We were talking before the pod, what is the most refreshing drink? And I nominated San Pellegrino. Steve countered with Beer Lao, right, Steve?
Yeah. It is not a commercial endorsement, but it is from personal experience. I think it's without question the finest beer in Southeast Asia.
I agree, with apologies to our friends in Singapore. Tiger, very strong contender. I'd probably put it number 2. A bit ahead of 333. Is it 33 or 333 in Vietnam? Simone, I might need some budget for some beer research. I hear biotech people love beer. No?
Let me tell you something, Jeff. As you know, I grew up in the UK where they know a thing or two about beer, and I am not a beer drinker. So budget's not coming for beer drinking. Nice. Now, that Brazil biotech thing that I was hearing about earlier, that sounds interesting.
There you go. I like where you're going with this, Simone. I thought for a while in the UK, weren't people like, there was some issue with the water and people had to turn to beer? Was that in ancient times or was that more of a modern thing?
Historical.
Historical.
Well, it was safer. It was safer to drink beer at one point. But anyway, should we talk molecular glues?
I do want to talk molecular glues.
Things get unglued pretty quick around here.
Things are coming unglued. Yeah.
I usually try to get us a little unglued. I find a tangent or two to beer to be refreshing. But hey, a deal between Gilead and Chimera is yet another sign that the CDK2 pipeline is moving in a degrader direction. Lauren, you took a closer look at this. What did you learn?
Well, so we're saying it's moving in a degrader direction because when you look at the clinical pipeline for CDK2, it's almost all traditional small molecules. And this is a new class. These are all in phase 1, 2, and phase 1. But when you look at the preclinical pipeline, it's almost all targeted degraders and molecular glue degraders against this. So I just think this is a good example of where these modalities, these newer degrading modalities, could potentially make a big impact. So the CDK field, this is hugely important for hormone receptor positive breast cancer. The CDK4/6 inhibitors are a big pillar of treatment there, and a huge market. And the problem is that, well, there are multiple problems. One of the problems is resistance develops. There are also some hematological toxicities associated with the class, and we're seeing a lot of innovation in the CDK field for breast cancer. And so, there are selective inhibitors against CDK4. Then there are the CDK2 inhibitors and degraders. The idea there is that by inhibiting CDK2 or degrading it, you could intercept and eliminate a key resistance pathway for the CDK4/6. Why degraders and molecular glue degraders are interesting here is a few reasons. This is a place where you could, have a PK benefit by eliminating the target, which, it takes a longer time to re-express these targets. So you don't have to dose as frequently as you might with a traditional small molecule. It also, there's a lot of conservation in the active sites of the CDKs. So you have a lot more flexibility with where you could target, which means you can end up with a more selective molecular compound. Resistance being such a problem there, I think it's a really interesting example of where there may be a big benefit. We've seen the degraders used in targets where we know degrading it can be effective. This is a place where there could potentially be an advantage over the modalities that we already have.
Lauren, your piece, which you worked on with Tierney Baum and Paul Bananos, has a pretty sweet CDK2 clinical pipeline chart. More than a dozen compounds checked in there. And of course, among the molecular glue degraders, in addition to Chimera, Gilead, we have Monte Rosa and Plexium. And deal terms, Chimera eligible for $85 million from Gilead. That's an upfront and option exercise payments. Total deal value, biobucks. Some folks love leading with the biobucks. $750 million. So, well, it's one we'll be watching. And speaking of deal terms, well, we're saving the biggest for last today. Early this morning, we learned that Abbvie is acquiring Capstan Therapeutics. Paul, you've been looking at this. What have you learned?
Sure. Yeah, it's a $2.1 billion deal that we learned about early Monday. Capstan is a few years old. It's an in vivo CAR T company. It's in the same vein, actually, as Esobiotech, which you were just talking about on the pod. So unlike CAR T therapies that require removal of cells, manipulating them outside the patient's body, and then returning them to the patient, this is done with a lipid nanoparticle platform, targeted lipid nanoparticle platform, they say. And it delivers nucleic acids in the LNP. In this case, it's mRNA in their lead program, encoding a CAR targeting CD19. And it's designed to deplete B cells that produce autoantibodies. So the idea is to reset the immune system and induce remission in patients with B cell mediated autoimmune disorders. It saves you a preconditioning step, the lymphodepletion that happens with other CAR Ts, and also saves manufacturing steps. So yes, it's just reached the clinic.
Paul, platform company here?
Yes, and that's interesting to me about this. It's very much a platform deal, or at least it appears to be that way, judging by language in the release. I mean, yes, there's a clinical program, but it's brand new and hasn't generated any data yet. And it looks like the buyer, Abbvie, is interested in using the platform in the future, not just getting a late-stage product. You know, most of the deals we've seen, billion-dollar M&A deals over the past few years, have been all about marketed or late-stage products. This doesn't seem like that. It seems like they want the tech, they want to develop more therapies, and they're willing to buy just a few weeks after Capstan finally reached the clinic.
Excellent. And as our colleague Stephen Hansen pointed out early this morning, as we were chatting about the deal, a lot of strategics in this deal, almost everybody except Abbvie, Pfizer, right. Bayer, Novartis, BMS, Lilly, and of course, outside of that, winners include Sofinova Investments, RA Capital, Forbion. Wow.
Orbimed and Vita were also in the seed.
Yep. Yeah, and J&J, another strategic in there. I don't know if we said that one yet. All right, well, Paul, thanks for that. I know you've got a busy day writing about this. It'll be on BioCentury.com in a few hours. And 1854, Simone, the Broad Street cholera outbreak is the answer to our questions. You were far too young to remember that. Younger even than Mr. Usden.
I think this week we need to be all eyes Wimbledon, and I look forward to us discussing next week on.
Excellent.
Excellent
well, give us your picks real quick, Simone, before we say farewell. You got
Alcaraz all the way.
Love it. And on the women's side,
come back to me.
All right. I always go Coco. You know that about me.
Coco could be Coco.
I love it. All right. Well, I'll be away for the next 2 weeks, but you'll be in very good hands with Stephen Hansen leading the pod, and Lauren, Selena, Simone, Steve, thanks as always for giving us your biotech insights, and thanks for tuning in. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury's podcasts. They'll be back with their next season in the fall, so keep an eye on their website, and farewell.
BioCentury would like to thank Icon Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how Icon Biotech can help you meet your critical milestones, go to iconplc.com/biotech.